70,000 years ago, humanity may have come closer to extinction than at any other point in our existence. Not slowly, not over centuries. In geological terms, almost instantly. Scientists discovered the evidence hidden somewhere no ancient survivor could ever intentionally leave a message. Inside human DNA itself, every person alive today carries signs of a population bottleneck so severe that researchers estimate our ancestors may have fallen to only a few thousand surviving humans across the entire planet. Less genetic diversity than chimpanzees, less than gorillas, an entire species reduced to numbers small enough to disappear forever from one failed season, one dying ecosystem, one winter that lasted too long. And whatever caused it did not begin with humans. It began beneath a mountain in what is now Indonesia. The eruption that followed was so violent that ash spread across continents, sunlight dimmed, temperatures dropped, entire ecosystems began collapsing from the bottom up. There is still a layer of that ash sitting beneath parts of India today, untouched after more than 70,000 years. Somewhere during that darkness, entire human lineages vanished so completely that we do not even know they existed. The people who survived were not trying to save humanity. They were simply trying to survive one more day. If this is your kind of thing, hit like and subscribe. It costs nothing and it keeps this channel going. And drop a comment below. Are you watching this winding down for the night or watching this during your active day? Now, let's go back to the moment our species almost disappeared forever, long before the ash entered the sky, before the cold years in the shrinking world. Small human groups already moved through Africa, with minds fully awake to pattern, memory, and meaning. They walked coastlines where waves folded over black stone shelves, crossed grasslands that changed color with the rains, and gathered beside rivers that sometimes vanished for generations before returning again. By 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had already existed in anatomically modern form for nearly 200,000 years. The shape of the human body was already familiar. The deeper transformation had happened quietly inside the mind. These people were not wandering creatures trapped in instinct. Fire traveled with them from camp to camp, carried in glowing fragments through darkness and wind. Stone points were shaped carefully by practiced hands, then fixed onto wooden shafts using adhesives made from heated mixtures of plant resin and powdered minerals. Hunting required planning, patience, and trust between individuals who depended on one another completely. Language likely moved constantly through these camps, not as isolated sounds, but as stories, warnings, memories, and shared knowledge passed between generations. Along the southern coast of Africa, inside Blombo's cave, traces of this inner world remained hidden for tens of thousands of years. Ochre pieces carved with geometric lines rested beneath layers of ancient sand. Tiny shell beads, pierced and worn against the body, suggested decoration and identity. The adhesives preserved there revealed an understanding of chemistry far older than once imagined, since combining ingredients in precise ways required experimentation, timing, and control of heat. These were minds capable of abstraction, capable of imagining something before it existed. Humanity had already begun testing the edges of the world beyond Africa. Fossils discovered in Mislia Cave, in what is now Israel, suggest that some Homo sapiens groups reached the Levant around 180,000 years ago. These migrations did not become permanent expansions. They were more like brief pulses into unfamiliar terrain before climates shifted again and pathways closed. The planet was already shared with other humans. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia, moving through cold forests and ice age valleys with heavy bodies adapted to winter climates. Denisovans spread across parts of eastern Asia, leaving behind only faint traces in bone and DNA. In some regions of Southeast Asia, Homo erectus may still have endured, carrying forward a lineage far older than our own. Even then, humanity existed in surprisingly small numbers. Perhaps only a few 100,000 Homo sapiens lived across the African continent, scattered across immense distances and separated by deserts, mountains, forests, and unstable climates. Wet centuries opened green corridors through the Sahara, then dry centuries sealed them shut again. Lakes expanded and disappeared. Animal migrations shifted with the seasons, forcing human groups to follow fragile ecological rhythms that could change within a lifetime. Intelligence alone did not guarantee safety in this world. Human survival depended on coastlines remaining fertile, rivers continuing to flow, grazing animals returning at the proper season. Small disruptions carried enormous consequences. A failed migration, a drying valley, or a changing wind pattern could erase entire communities without leaving a trace behind. Beneath the growing sophistication of human culture, the foundation remained delicate, balanced carefully against an earth that was already beginning to change. On the island of Sumatra, surrounded now by steep green ridges and drifting morning mist, there is a lake so large that from certain shores the opposite side fades into pale blue distance. Fishing boats move slowly across its surface. Villages rest quietly along the waterline. At first glance, Lake Toba appears ancient and peaceful, stretching nearly 100 kilometers from end to end and roughly 30 kilometers across. The stillness conceals the shape of an older violence buried beneath the landscape itself. What fills with water today was once the roof of an immense underground magma chamber. 73,000 to 75,000 years ago, that chamber failed catastrophically. The land above it collapsed inward after one of the largest volcanic eruptions Earth has experienced within the last 2 million years. Modern volcanologists describe Toba as a supervolcano, not because of the height of a mountain peak, but because of the staggering scale hidden below the surface. Ordinary volcanoes often grow upward over time, building cones layer by layer through repeated eruptions. A supervolcano behaves differently. Its magma reservoir spreads outward beneath the crust across enormous distances, and when pressure finally releases, the ground itself caves inward, forming a vast depression known as a caldera. The caldera beneath Lake Toba is among the largest on Earth. The lake occupying it has become the largest volcanic lake in the world, resting above a geological wound so immense that its dimensions are difficult for the human mind to hold clearly. Scientists estimate the eruption expelled around 2,800 cubic kilometers of magma into the atmosphere and across the surrounding land. For comparison, the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980 released roughly 1 cubic kilometer. Toba exceeded it by approximately 5,000 times. The eruption column rose upward with extraordinary force, carrying ash and gases nearly 50 kilometers into the stratosphere. At that altitude, material no longer falls quickly back to Earth. Winds begin carrying it across oceans and continents in slow planetary circulation. Tiny particles drift for months or years, spreading invisibly through the upper atmosphere before descending again far from their source. The evidence of this dispersal remains preserved across half the world. Geologists have identified Toba ash in sediment layers throughout India, the Arabian Peninsula, East Africa, and deep beneath the South China Sea. In parts of the Indian subcontinent, the ash settled into layers nearly 15 centimeters thick. enough to remain clearly visible in geological cores after tens of thousands of years. Under microscopes, the volcanic glass fragments reveal chemical signatures unique to Toba, like mineral fingerprints resting silently within ancient earth. The eruption transformed not only the region around Sumatra, but atmospheric systems spanning the planet. Entire forests near the volcano would have disappeared beneath incandescent flows of gas, ash, and pulverized rock moving faster than storms. Rivers altered course, coastlines shifted, sunlight dimmed beneath suspended particles, circling high above the atmosphere. Yet at the center of all of it remained the collapsing chamber beneath Sumatra, the moment when pressure accumulated over geological ages, released in a span of days. Today, the lake reflects clouds and distant mountains with almost perfect calm. Beneath those waters, the crust of Earth still carries the memory of the eruption that nearly coincided with humanity's narrowest passage through time. High above the weather, beyond the height where rain clouds gather and storms dissolve, the atmosphere becomes strangely still. In that quiet layer of sky, the material expelled from Toba began spreading outward around the planet. Billions of tons of sulfur dioxide drifted into the stratosphere, rising far above ordinary winds. There, the gas encountered water vapor suspended in the cold upper air and transformed into microscopic droplets of sulfuric acid aerosol, so small they could remain aloft for years. These particles altered sunlight itself. Incoming solar radiation, which normally warmed oceans, forests, and grasslands, was reflected back toward space before it could reach the ground. The effect resembled a thin planetary veil drawn across the atmosphere, dimming the surface beneath it. Scientists estimate the eruption may have injected between 1 billion and 6 billion tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Climate models attempting to reconstruct the aftermath suggest average global temperatures fell between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius. In some continental interiors and elevated regions, cooling may have reached 10 to 15 degrees. The shift did not pass quickly. Estimates for the volcanic winter range from 6 years to nearly a decade of weakened sunlight, colder seasons, and disrupted rainfall. For ecosystems already balanced delicately between wet and dry cycles, the cooling spread through food webs with quiet force. Photosynthesis slowed beneath the dimmed skies. Plants produced less energy. Leaves withered earlier in the season. Seeds failed to mature. The collapse moved upward through the chain of life from grasses to grazing animals, from grazing animals to predators, until entire landscapes carried less movement than before. In tropical Africa, where most Homo sapiens populations still lived, the cold arrived in a form unlike the seasonal winters of northern latitudes. Human groups adapted to warm climates suddenly faced unfamiliar temperatures alongside dwindling food supplies. The monsoon systems that fed rivers and seasonal wetlands may also have weakened under the atmospheric disruption. Rains became less reliable, dry periods lengthened, water holes contracted inward, their muddy edges marked with concentrated tracks from thirsty animals arriving from farther and farther away. Lakes across eastern Africa appear to have dropped dramatically during this period. Sediment cores preserve traces of shrinking shorelines and altered vegetation, suggesting ecosystems compressed into smaller surviving zones. Herds that once migrated through broad territories may have fragmented or vanished from familiar routes entirely. Trees retreated from some regions. Grasslands in others became sparse and brittle beneath cooler temperatures and reduced rainfall. On the ground, the world would not have resembled a sudden apocalypse. The transformation unfolded through accumulating absences. Morning light arrived weaker than memory expected. Certain birds no longer appeared during migration seasons. Familiar fruiting plants produced little. Rivers narrowed into strings of isolated pools. Hunting journeys stretched farther from camp and returned with less success. Ash settling from distant skies coated leaves and collected in shallow water, leaving a fine mineral grit across the land. The atmosphere itself may have carried a strange muted quality during those years. Sunlight filtered through suspended particles high above the earth. Days remained dimmer even when clouds were absent. Nights grew colder beneath clearer air and weakened heat retention. Across continents, living systems adjusted unevenly to conditions no species had experienced within recorded memory. For small human populations already surviving close to ecological limits, the volcanic winter did not arrive as a single disaster. It arrived as a long season of narrowing possibilities, unfolding year after year beneath a fading sun. Beneath the floors of oceans and lakes, Earth keeps its memories in layers. Year after year, particles drift downward through water and settle softly into mud, building thin pages of sediment that accumulate almost invisibly across immense stretches of time. Pollen grains, fragments of shell, volcanic dust, and traces of ancient chemistry become compressed together into quiet archives. Long after rivers change course and forests disappear, those layers remain undisturbed in darkness below. Within these sediments, scientists discovered a pale band unlike the material above or below it. The layer appeared across enormous distances throughout the Indian Ocean region, preserved in ocean cores, lake beds, and buried land deposits. Geologists named it the youngest Toba tuff, the surviving ash from the eruption in Sumatra. Its presence allowed researchers to synchronize distant landscapes to the same moment in geological time, almost like aligning clocks separated by continents. This method belongs to a field called tephrochronology, the practice of using volcanic ash layers as precise chronological markers within archaeological and geological records. Volcanic eruptions scatter microscopic fragments of glass and minerals into the atmosphere, and each eruption carries its own distinctive chemical composition. Under laboratory analysis, the ash from Toba reveals a unique ratio of trace elements and crystalline structures. These signatures behave almost like fingerprints, allowing scientists to identify the eruption wherever its particles eventually settled. In East Africa, some archaeological sites preserve human occupation layers directly beneath and above the Toba ash horizon. Stone tools, hearth remnants, animal bones, and traces of habitation appear in sequence around the volcanic deposit, creating a stratigraphic relationship between human activity and the eruption itself. At several locations, the record changes noticeably after the ash layer. Certain tool traditions disappear. Occupation becomes intermittent. In some places, there are gaps where signs of human presence grow sparse for extended periods before returning again. Far from the African continent, the floor of the Bay of Bengal carries another version of the same story. Sediment cores extracted from deep marine deposits show the Toba ash clearly embedded within the layers. Above it, the chemistry of the sediment shifts abruptly. Biological productivity declines sharply, visible through reduced traces of microscopic marine organisms that once thrived in warmer, nutrient rich waters. The oceans themselves appear to have entered a period of ecological stress after the eruption darkened the atmosphere. The polar ice sheets preserve evidence in an entirely different form. In Greenland and Antarctica, snow accumulated year after year into immense frozen stacks, trapping tiny quantities of atmospheric material within each seasonal layer. Sulfate concentrations preserved in these ice cores rise dramatically around 73,000 years ago, suggesting a major injection of volcanic gases into the global atmosphere. Even at the edges of the planet, the eruption left a detectable signal suspended within ancient ice. Sediment cores also contain fossil pollen, carried by wind and water from vanished landscapes. After the eruption, pollen records in several regions show forests retreating, while grasslands contracted under cooler and drier conditions. Certain plant species diminish suddenly, replaced by hardier vegetation adapted to environmental stress. These transitions unfold gradually through the layers, like watching ecosystems redraw themselves in slow motion. No human witness recorded the eruption in words. The evidence survived instead in minerals, chemistry, and microscopic grains buried patiently beneath Earth's surface, waiting for a species that nearly vanished to learn how to read them. Inside every human cell, coiled into structures too small for the eye to see, there are sequences inherited across an almost unbroken chain of births, stretching deep into prehistoric time. DNA changes slowly, generation after generation, carrying tiny mutations forward like faint marks copied repeatedly by hand. Most of these changes are harmless, some disappear, others spread quietly through populations until they become shared by millions of descendants. By studying these patterns, population geneticists learned that humanity carries evidence of an ancient constriction hidden within its own biology. The clue first became unmistakable during the 1990s when researchers began comparing genetic variation across human populations worldwide. The expectation had been that a species spread across every continent would contain enormous diversity. Instead, humans appeared unusually similar to one another at the genetic level. The differences between populations from distant parts of the world were surprisingly small. Compared with other great apes, the contrast became even stranger. A chimpanzee population, numbering roughly 300,000 individuals, contains more genetic variation than the entire human species, despite humanity now numbering around 8 billion. This pattern pointed toward what geneticists call a bottleneck, a period when a population shrinks so severely that much of its genetic diversity disappears permanently. When only a small number of individuals survive, many lineages vanish with those who leave no descendants. The future population inherits only the reduced variation carried by the survivors. Some of the clearest evidence appears within mitochondrial DNA, a small set of genetic material passed almost exclusively from mother to child. Because it changes at a relatively steady rate over time, scientists can trace maternal ancestry backward through countless generations. The surviving mitochondrial lineages of all living humans eventually converge on a woman who lived in Africa approximately 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. Researchers sometimes call her mitochondrial Eve, not as the first human woman, but as the most recent common maternal ancestor whose lineage endured continuously into the present. A similar pattern appears in the Y chromosome, passed from father to son. Analysis of Y chromosomal inheritance reveals another relatively recent convergence, often referred to as Y chromosomal Adam. These two individuals were not necessarily contemporaries, nor were they the only humans alive during their eras. Their significance lies in survival. Other maternal and paternal lines once existed alongside theirs, but over immense stretches of time, those lines ended quietly as descendants failed to continue. The narrowing becomes visible in other forms of genetic analysis as well. Microsatellites, rapidly mutating regions scattered throughout the genome, preserve statistical signatures of population history. Across global human populations, these patterns consistently suggest a severe reduction followed by later expansion. The signal remains strongest outside Africa, where genetic diversity declines further. African populations retain slightly greater variation, consistent with the idea that smaller groups branched outward from an already diminished ancestral population and carried only part of its diversity into the wider world. Even today, the traces remain measurable. Every person living outside Africa descends from founding groups so small that their limited genetic inheritance still shapes the structure of modern genomes tens of thousands of years later. Beneath languages, nations, and cultures, humanity carries the biological imprint of a time when only a narrow fraction of its ancient diversity survived the passage through catastrophe. In modern cities, 10,000 people can fill a few apartment towers. A population of 1,000 might occupy only a small village tucked beside a river or mountain road. Yet numbers like these now appear in scientific models describing the entire human species during one of the narrowest passages in its history. The scale feels almost impossible when placed against the billions alive today, but the mathematics of genetics keeps returning to the same unsettling conclusion. Humanity became very small. The exact size of that surviving population remains debated because ancient numbers cannot be counted directly. No census exists from 70,000 years ago. Researchers instead reconstruct population history indirectly through DNA, statistical modeling, and patterns of inherited variation distributed across living people. Different methods produce different estimates, and scientists approach those estimates cautiously, aware that small assumptions can shift results dramatically over immense stretches of time. One of the landmark studies appeared in the year 2000, when geneticists Lynn Jord and Henry Harpending analyzed human genetic diversity and estimated an effective breeding population of roughly 10,000 individuals during the bottleneck period. Effective population size does not mean the total number of humans physically alive. In population genetics, the term refers specifically to the number of individuals successfully contributing genes into future generations. In any species, this number is smaller than the total headcount because not every individual has surviving descendants. Some die young, some never reproduce, and some lineages simply end over time. Even so, 10,000 breeding individuals already implied a species balanced dangerously close to disappearance. Later genomic studies, using more sophisticated computational tools and larger data sets, pushed the estimates lower still. Some analyses suggested the effective breeding population may have fallen to around 1,280 individuals at its most extreme point. That number approaches the population size of endangered mountain gorillas living today in isolated regions of Central Africa. A species conservationists consider perpetually vulnerable to disease, habitat loss, and random ecological disruption. In 2023, a study published in the journal Science introduced a new analytical method known as FITCOL, short for Fast Infinitesimal Time Coalescent Process. Researchers applied it to the genomes of more than 3,000 modern humans drawn from populations around the world. Their results suggested that ancestral human populations may have remained below roughly 1,300 breeding individuals for approximately 117,000 years. Rather than a brief collapse followed by rapid recovery, the model described an extended period of severe restriction lasting across countless generations. The findings immediately sparked debate. Some researchers argued that the FITCOL method might blur together several separate bottlenecks occurring at different times, or amplify signals shaped by migration patterns and changing population structures. Others questioned whether present-day genomes preserve enough clarity to reconstruct demographic events so ancient with complete confidence. Yet even critics generally agreed on the broader conclusion that human populations experienced at least one profound reduction in size somewhere within this period of prehistory. At such low numbers, survival becomes extraordinarily fragile. A prolonged drought, reducing available water, an epidemic moving through closely related groups, or the collapse of a critical food source could alter the fate of the entire species. Genetic diversity narrows. Local extinctions matter more. Random events gain enormous influence over the future. For generation after generation, humanity may have existed within margins so thin that the continuation of our species depended not on dominance or abundance, but simply on enough individuals enduring long enough for the line to continue. Along certain coastlines, survival can persist long after inland ecosystems begin to fail. Waves continue arriving with mechanical regularity. Tides still expose narrow bands of edible life, and cliffs provide shelter against shifting weather. During periods when surrounding regions become hostile, these isolated pockets sometimes remain habitable. Paleoanthropologists use the term refugia for such places, small geographic sanctuaries where plants, animals, and humans endure while conditions deteriorate elsewhere. The search for humanity's refugia after the Toba eruption has become one of the central debates in the study of early Homo sapiens. If populations across much of Africa faced collapsing ecosystems, prolonged cooling, and unreliable rainfall, then survival likely depended on access to unusually stable environments. Rather than enduring evenly across the continent, human groups may have retreated into scattered ecological shelters separated by vast distances of increasingly unlivable terrain. Among the strongest candidates is the southern coast of Africa, especially the region surrounding Pinnacle Point in the Western Cape. There, steep cliffs overlook the Indian Ocean, and cave systems preserve traces of human occupation extending through the period associated with the eruption. Excavations led by archaeologist Curtis Marion and his team revealed a remarkable continuity within the archaeological layers. Human presence appears before the climatic disruption, persists through it, and continues afterward without complete abandonment. What made this coastline different was not abundance in the modern sense, but reliability. The intertidal zone provided food sources less vulnerable to rapid atmospheric cooling than inland ecosystems dependent on seasonal rainfall. Shellfish, limpets, mussels, sea urchins, and other marine organisms remained accessible throughout the year, gathered from rocky shore platforms exposed during low tide. The surrounding ocean changed temperature more slowly than land because of its immense thermal mass, buffering coastal environments against the sharpest extremes of the volcanic winter. The people living at Pinnacle Point appear to have understood this landscape intimately. Archaeological evidence suggests systematic shellfish harvesting rather than opportunistic gathering. Silkrete stone was heat treated before shaping, improving the quality of tools through controlled exposure to fire. Ochre pigments were processed and carried deliberately, hinting at symbolic practices continuing even during periods of environmental instability. These were not populations merely enduring passively. They adapted with precision to narrow ecological margins. Other possible refugia have been proposed across Africa and nearby regions. Along the East African Rift Valley, cave systems associated with geothermal activity may have retained localized warmth and access to fresh water during colder periods. Volcanic landscapes, their created microenvironments capable of sustaining vegetation and animal life, even when surrounding areas became drier. The Arabian Peninsula, now dominated by desert, also moved through wetter climatic phases during parts of prehistory. Ancient coastlines and interior lakes once supported human occupation across regions that today appear barren. Some researchers suggest small populations may have survived along these shores as well, sustained by marine resources and periodic rainfall patterns different from those farther inland. The refugia model paints a picture of humanity fragmented into isolated enclaves, each separated by stretches of difficult territory. Genetic exchange between groups may have become rare for generations at a time. Small communities adapted to highly specific local conditions, surviving not because the wider world remained stable, but because certain landscapes continued offering enough water, food, and shelter to sustain human life through an age of environmental contraction. When the tide retreats from a rocky shoreline, it leaves behind a temporary world of exposed pools, clinging mussels, trapped fish, and slow moving shellfish fixed to stone. For people who understood the rhythm of the sea, these narrow windows offered nourishment that returned again and again with remarkable consistency. The coastal survival hypothesis proposes that this relationship with marine environments did more than shelter isolated human groups during ecological collapse. It may have been the specific reason our species endured at all. Along the southern African coast, ancient shell middens preserve traces of this dependence, stretching far deeper into the past than the Toba eruption itself. These middens are accumulations of discarded shells left behind after repeated harvesting and consumption. At Pinnacle Point, some date to roughly 164,000 years ago, indicating that humans had already spent nearly 90,000 years refining coastal lifeways before the volcanic winter began. By the time environmental instability intensified across much of Africa, certain populations were already deeply adapted to extracting food from the intertidal zone. Marine resources possess qualities that made them unusually valuable during periods of climatic stress. A single large abalone contains concentrated protein and fat, gathered without the enormous energy expenditure required for long inland hunts. Shellfish beds replenish naturally and predictably. Unlike migratory herds or seasonal plant growth, many coastal food sources remain accessible throughout the year. Fish, mollusks, sea urchins, and crustaceans form some of the most nutritionally complete foods available to hunter-gatherers, rich not only in calories but also in essential fatty acids and micronutrients. Among these nutrients is docosahexaenoic acid, commonly known as DHA, found abundantly in marine foods and deeply important for brain development and neurological function. Some researchers have suggested that long-term access to coastal diets may have supported cognitive complexity within surviving Homo sapiens populations, not by creating intelligence suddenly, but by sustaining energetically expensive human brains through difficult environmental conditions. The coastline also provided other forms of stability. Fresh water often collected near estuaries where rivers met the sea, or emerged from coastal springs sheltered within limestone formations. Sea caves and rock overhangs offered protection from wind and temperature shifts. Kelp forests and tidal ecosystems buffered seasonal fluctuations, creating landscapes where food resources changed gradually rather than collapsing abruptly. Living beside the ocean required careful observation and memory. Harvesting shellfish successfully depended on understanding tidal timing, wave patterns, seasonal spawning cycles, and the hidden dangers of slippery stone shelves exposed only briefly between surges. Navigating these coastlines demanded planning and coordination within groups. The environment rewarded attentiveness, patience, and the ability to predict repeating natural rhythms across days and seasons. Genetic evidence adds another layer to this possibility. Modern southern African populations, especially the San peoples, carry some of the oldest and most divergent human genetic lineages known today. Their ancestry suggests extremely deep roots within southern Africa, consistent with prolonged isolation in a refugium where populations remained separated from much of the continent for vast stretches of time. For the people living along those shores, the wider human world may have faded almost entirely beyond reach. Inland territories grew increasingly difficult to cross. Contact between distant groups became rare. Generations may have passed without encountering unfamiliar humans. Languages, traditions, and genetic lineages narrowed within these isolated communities while the sea continued its endless movements beside them, offering just enough continuity for survival to persist through centuries of contraction. Across parts of Africa, there are archaeological sites where human presence simply fades away. Stone flakes remain scattered beside ancient hearths. Animal bones lie buried within old sediments. Then, above those layers, the traces stop. No more tools appear. No fresh charcoal darkens the soil. Wind-blown dust and slowly accumulating earth settle over places where people once gathered, hunted, shaped pigments, and slept beneath open skies. The silence that follows can last thousands of years. The genetic bottleneck did not merely reduce human numbers, it erased lineages. Most of the human families alive before 70,000 years ago left no descendants living today. Population genetics allows researchers to estimate not only how small the surviving group became, but how much diversity vanished during the contraction. The answer appears to be devastatingly large. Many branches of humanity ended completely, carrying with them combinations of genes, memories, and traditions that had developed across countless generations. Archaeological patterns hint at this disappearance in fragmented ways. Several sites in East and North Africa preserve evidence of occupation before the Toba period, followed by long interruptions or dramatic cultural shifts afterward. Some regions that once supported repeated human activity appear sparsely inhabited for extended stretches of time. The landscape did not become empty everywhere at once, but human presence became thinner, more isolated, more fragile. What vanished was not only biological variation. Entire cultural worlds disappeared alongside the people who carried them. Languages spoken for millennia fell silent without leaving descendants to remember their sounds. Distinct methods of shaping stone or preparing food ended when the final practitioners died. Knowledge of local migration routes, medicinal plants, rituals, stories, burial customs, and symbolic meanings dissolved gradually into absence. Unlike later civilizations that left written records, these populations preserved memory only through living transmission from one person to another. When the chain broke, the culture disappeared with it. There is no way to know how many separate human societies existed before the bottleneck. The surviving archaeological fragments offer only scattered glimpses into a much larger human landscape, now permanently beyond recovery. Entire populations may have flourished for thousands of years in regions where erosion, flooding, or later geological processes erased nearly all evidence of their existence. The survivors themselves were not necessarily superior in intelligence, strength, or creativity. Survival during ecological collapse often depends on geography, timing, and access to resources that remain stable slightly longer than elsewhere. A group positioned near dependable marine food sources might endure, while another equally skilled population farther inland gradually disappears through drought and scarcity. Luck enters the history of survival more deeply than human beings often prefer to admit. Geneticists describe one consequence of this process as the founder effect. When only a small number of individuals survive and later repopulate the species, their traits become disproportionately influential in shaping future generations. Characteristics once rare can become widespread simply because they happen to exist among the survivors. The biological patterns shared across modern humanity emerged partly from this narrowing. Every universal feature carried broadly through Homo sapiens today passed through that constricted ancestral population. Certain immune responses, neurological tendencies, metabolic traits, and inherited predispositions persisted because specific individuals endured while others did not. The people who vanished may have resembled us completely in thought, emotion, and imagination. Their absence from the present reflects not inferiority, but the brutal arithmetic of survival within a collapsing world where entire futures could disappear, depending on which valley still held water and which shoreline still offered food. Scientific debates often persist longest around events that changed everything while leaving behind only partial traces. The connection between the Toba eruption and the human bottleneck belongs to that category. Many researchers believe the eruption played a major role in reducing human populations to dangerously low numbers. Others argue the evidence remains incomplete and that humanity's decline may have begun before the skies over Sumatra darkened with ash. The timing is one reason the debate became so intense. Genetic studies usually place the major human bottleneck somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 years ago. Geological dating places the Toba eruption roughly 73,000 to 75,000 years ago. The overlap is close enough to seem meaningful. A volcanic winter severe enough to disrupt ecosystems across continents appears capable of pushing already fragile human populations toward collapse. Yet ancient dates are never perfectly precise. Genetic timelines rely on statistical models built from mutation rates and inherited variation, while volcanic deposits must be dated through geological methods carrying their own uncertainties. The ranges overlap strongly, but not strongly enough to prove direct causation beyond doubt. Newer research complicated the picture even further. The 2023 FitCol study, which analyzed genomes from more than 3,000 living humans, suggested that the deepest population crash in human ancestry may have occurred much earlier, between 800,000 and 900,000 years ago. Under this interpretation, humanity's genetic narrowing began long before Toba erupted. The volcanic catastrophe may still have intensified the decline, but it would not represent the sole cause. Archaeological evidence also resists a simple story of total devastation. At several sites in South Africa and India, human occupation appears to continue across the ash layer associated with Toba. Stone tools remain present both below and above the deposits, suggesting some populations endured locally despite the eruption. A study published in 2010 examined Middle Paleolithic sites in southern India and found technological continuity through the ash horizon. The people there may have survived without catastrophic interruption to daily life. Some researchers see this as evidence against a near-extinction scenario linked directly to Toba. Others disagree. Survival within isolated refugia does not exclude widespread collapse elsewhere. A species can lose most of its population while small groups continue surviving in scattered pockets of stable habitat. The archaeological record may therefore preserve islands of continuity within a much larger pattern of contraction. There is also increasing support for the idea that humanity faced not one disaster, but a prolonged era of climatic instability. Africa during this period experienced repeated shifts between wetter and drier conditions, altering vegetation, water availability, and migration routes over thousands of years. Under this model, Toba becomes one extreme episode within a broader environmental struggle already placing pressure on human survival. Most researchers today settle into a careful middle ground. The eruption almost certainly affected human populations in significant ways. Atmospheric cooling, ecological stress, and shrinking resources likely intensified hardships already unfolding across prehistoric landscapes. Whether Toba alone caused the bottleneck, or whether it amplified deeper climatic pressures already shaping human history, remains unresolved. The uncertainty itself has become part of the story, revealing how multiple forces may have converged during one of the narrowest passages our species ever endured. Far from Sumatra, beyond the seas and volcanic mountains of Indonesia, the Indian subcontinent became one of the places most heavily transformed by the eruption. Ash drifted westward through the atmosphere in enormous quantities before descending slowly across rivers, forests, grasslands, and ancient human landscapes. In some regions of India, the deposits reached roughly 15 centimeters thick. Closer to the source, certain areas may have received layers far deeper, enough to bury vegetation and alter entire ecosystems beneath a blanket of pulverized volcanic material. Today, the ash remains visible beneath the surface across vast portions of the subcontinent. Geologists have identified the Toba layer in locations separated by enormous distances, making it one of the most geographically extensive ash deposits ever documented from a single eruption. Embedded within ancient sediments, the pale horizon stretches across India like the residue of a planetary weather event frozen into stone. Among the most important archaeological regions connected to this story is the Juraru Valley in southern India. There, excavations uncovered evidence of human occupation both beneath and above the Toba ash layer. Stone tools appear in the older sediments before the eruption, then continue afterward within younger deposits. The continuity drew immediate scientific attention because it complicated the idea of total human disappearance across the region. In some cases, the tools found above the ash resemble those below it so closely that archaeologists struggle to distinguish them. The shapes, flaking patterns, and manufacturing techniques remain remarkably consistent across the boundary created by the eruption. One possibility is that the same human populations survived locally despite the environmental disruption. Another is that new groups later entered the region carrying similar technological traditions. The archaeological record alone cannot fully resolve which explanation is correct. Even the identity of the people living in India before the eruption remains uncertain. Some researchers believe Homo sapiens had already reached the subcontinent before Toba erupted. Others argue the inhabitants may instead have belonged to older human lineages, such as Homo erectus or related archaic populations still surviving in parts of Asia during this period. If archaic humans occupied India before the eruption and later disappeared, while modern humans arrived afterward, then the volcanic catastrophe may have altered the demographic future of the region in ways impossible to reconstruct completely. The environmental consequences across India would have been severe regardless of who lived there. Thick ash deposits, smothered vegetation, and disrupted freshwater systems. Landscapes dependent on edible plants and seasonal growth cycles may have become temporarily barren. Any population relying heavily on gathered plant foods would have faced immediate pressure as leaves, seeds, and grasses vanished beneath mineral dust. Rivers carrying suspended ash likely became difficult to drink from, while grazing animals either migrated away or died in shrinking numbers. Yet volcanic destruction often carries an unusual long-term transformation within it. Ash contains minerals such as phosphorus, potassium, and trace nutrients that gradually enrich soils as weathering breaks the particles apart. Over decades and centuries, land initially devastated by volcanic deposits can become exceptionally fertile. Much later in human history, some of the agricultural richness associated with parts of the Indian subcontinent may have rested partly upon minerals dispersed during the eruption itself. The ash that once darkened skies and buried living ground eventually settled into the foundation of future ecosystems, remaining beneath the surface long after the people who witnessed its arrival disappeared from history. While Homo sapiens struggled through ecological instability in Africa, another human species occupied the colder landscapes of Europe and Western Asia. Neanderthals lived among pine forests, limestone valleys, and glacial grasslands shaped by long winters and shifting ice. Their world already demanded endurance against freezing temperatures, seasonal scarcity, and unpredictable hunting conditions, long before the eruption at Toba darkened skies farther south. Neanderthal bodies reflected this environment. They were shorter and more powerfully built than modern humans, with broad chests and dense musculature that conserved heat efficiently in cold climates. Their large nasal passages may have helped warm icy air before it reached the lungs, reducing stress during winter breathing. Archaeological evidence also suggests behavioral adaptations tuned carefully to harsh seasonal rhythms. They hunted large ice age mammals, controlled fire, and sheltered within caves and constructed living spaces capable of withstanding prolonged cold. Because of these adaptations, Neanderthals may have been less vulnerable to some of the environmental effects that devastated tropical ecosystems. Europe, during the late Pleistocene, already oscillated between cold and colder conditions. Plant and animal communities there were structured around survival in difficult climates. A drop in global temperature would still have created pressure, but not necessarily the same ecological shock experienced in regions dependent on stable warmth and rainfall. Archaeological sites across Europe show surprisingly little evidence for a sudden Neanderthal collapse corresponding directly to the Toba eruption. Stone tool traditions continue through this period without obvious interruption in many regions. Occupation layers persist in caves scattered across France, Spain, Croatia, and other parts of the continent. The eruption appears not to have erased Neanderthal populations in the way some earlier models predicted. The picture becomes more complicated farther east and south. Toba ash reached portions of the Middle East where Neanderthals also lived, and some sites there show signs of disruption during the period following the eruption. Certain occupations become intermittent or fragmented. Yet even in these areas, the archaeological record does not point toward extinction. Neanderthal populations endured long after the volcanic winter ended. This contrast matters because it suggests that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals faced the same global event from very different ecological positions. Our African ancestors may have been more exposed to the collapse of warm weather ecosystems and monsoon-driven food webs, while Neanderthals inhabited regions already adapted to climatic instability. The catastrophe that nearly erased Homo sapiens may have been less devastating for their northern relatives. Ironically, Neanderthals survived Toba only to disappear much later, around 40,000 years ago. Their extinction unfolded after Homo sapiens expanded outward from Africa in growing numbers. By then, the relationship between the two species had become far more complex than simple replacement. Genetic studies reveal that modern non African populations carry approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, inherited through episodes of interbreeding that occurred after migrating. Homo sapiens encountered Neanderthal groups across Eurasia. Fragments of Neanderthal biology remain present within living people today, preserved quietly inside immune system genes, skin adaptations, and other inherited traits. Their disappearance was therefore not absolute. It became partially absorbed into the expanding human lineage that eventually spread across the planet. For a brief period after Toba, however, the balance may have tilted unexpectedly in Neanderthal favor. While Homo sapiens populations contracted sharply within Africa, Neanderthals appear to have remained comparatively stable across parts of Eurasia. The eruption that nearly destroyed our species may have temporarily reduced competition between these human groups, creating a strange inversion within prehistory where the lineage that ultimately survived became, for a time, the more vulnerable one. For thousands of years after the eruption, traces of human activity become strangely faint across large parts of the archaeological record. Campsites that once appeared repeatedly across landscapes grow rare. Tool assemblages thin out. Some regions preserve long stretches of sediment where evidence of human presence nearly disappears altogether. Researchers studying this interval sometimes describe it as the long silence, a period between roughly 70,000 and 60,000 years ago when humanity seems to contract inward, surviving in scattered pockets while much of the wider world grows quiet. The silence was not absolute. People remained alive in refugia along coasts, valleys, and other stable environments. Yet the surviving populations appear to have been small, separated, and vulnerable in ways difficult to fully imagine today. Population models suggest that even after the immediate environmental shocks passed, recovery would have unfolded with painful slowness. Isolated bands numbering only dozens, or perhaps a few hundred individuals, may have remained cut off from one another for countless generations. At such low numbers, biology itself becomes fragile. Inbreeding begins exerting pressure when populations shrink below a few thousand individuals for extended periods. Harmful recessive mutations become more likely to appear. Fertility can decline gradually. Immune system diversity narrows, reducing resilience against disease. Random chance begins influencing survival as strongly as adaptation. A localized drought, epidemic, or hunting failure can erase an entire lineage permanently when there are so few people left to absorb the loss. The human experience during this era would have felt profoundly isolated. Entire lifetimes may have passed without encountering unfamiliar groups. A child could grow old hearing only the voices of the same small community, never seeing strangers beyond distant tracks or occasional smoke along the horizon. Parents, grandparents, and grandchildren may all have lived and died within narrow territories, bounded not by choice, but by the danger of traveling through unstable landscapes, offering little certainty of food or water. Cultural knowledge also changes under these conditions. Complex skills survive only when enough people remain to teach, practice, and preserve them continuously. In large populations, expertise can specialize across individuals and generations. In tiny populations, knowledge becomes easier to lose. A single death can erase an entire technique if no apprentice learned it fully. Certain methods of tool making, food preparation, or symbolic tradition may have vanished simply because the last person carrying them failed to pass them onward before dying. Yet some researchers believe the pressure of this isolation may also have intensified innovation among the survivors. Small groups facing unstable conditions would have depended heavily on planning, communication, memory, and social cooperation. Adaptability became essential. Technologies requiring precision, such as compound adhesives, heat treated stone, or carefully organized food gathering strategies, may have spread because survival increasingly favored cognitive flexibility and close coordination within groups. Genetically, however, the losses endured during this period remain irreversible. Variations that disappeared from the human lineage are gone permanently. Entire branches of ancestral diversity ended without descendants, leaving only statistical shadows inside modern genomes where richer variation once existed. Scientists can measure the narrowing, infer its timing, and model its consequences, but the missing lineages themselves can never be recovered. The long silence was therefore not empty. It was a prolonged narrowing of humanity into smaller circles of survival, where the future of the species rested quietly within isolated communities, enduring one difficult generation after another. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the archaeological silence begins to loosen. Around 65,000 to 60,000 years ago, traces of human activity become more frequent across parts of Africa. Stone tools appear in greater variety. Occupation sites grow denser. Materials begin moving across wider distances. The scattered remnants of small surviving populations start reconnecting with the wider landscape as ecosystems recover from centuries of instability. The climate itself was softening during this period. Temperatures rose slowly after the harshest years of volcanic cooling faded into the background of geological time. Rainfall patterns strengthened again across portions of Africa, and monsoon systems regained some of their earlier rhythm. Rivers expanded, vegetation thickened, and animal populations gradually returned to territories that had once become barren or unpredictable. The world remained dangerous and unstable by modern standards, but the narrowest point had passed. What appears in the archaeological record afterward is not merely survival, but experimentation. Sites from southern Africa reveal increasingly refined technologies shaped with precision and planning. Stone blades become thinner, sharper, and more standardized. Pigments such as ochre appear in larger quantities, often ground carefully and processed deliberately rather than collected casually. Personal ornamentation becomes more visible as shell beads and decorated objects begin appearing in contexts suggesting symbolic use. Archaeologists associate much of this transformation with industries known as Still Bay and Howie Sans Port, cultural traditions that emerged in southern Africa during this recovering world. These industries reveal levels of technical sophistication that stand among the most remarkable anywhere on Earth at the time. Carefully shaped bifacial points, delicate bladelets, and composite tools requiring multiple stages of preparation indicate populations capable of abstract planning, extending well beyond immediate survival. The Howison's port industry, dating to approximately 65,000 years ago, is especially striking. Backed bladelets, small enough to fit into hafted tools, appear alongside finely worked bone implements and engraved geometric markings cut into stone or ochre surfaces. These artifacts suggest minds deeply engaged in symbolism, memory, and communication. The markings themselves may have carried meanings now permanently lost, yet their existence reveals people thinking beyond simple utility. Movement across landscapes also becomes easier to detect. Marine shells originating along the coast appear at inland sites located more than 100 kilometers away. Certain stone materials traveled equally long distances before being shaped into tools. Whether through seasonal migration, exchange between groups, or expanding social networks, humans were beginning to reconnect after generations of isolation. Information, resources, and perhaps stories themselves may once again have moved gradually between communities separated for centuries. Ochre processing sites from this era carry a particularly quiet significance. Red pigments were ground, mixed, and stored with care, sometimes alongside engraved pieces bearing repeating patterns. These activities likely held symbolic or ritual importance beyond practical function alone. Cultural expression appears not to have diminished under hardship, but in some ways intensified through it. As populations remained numerically small, their inner worlds may have become richer and more structured. The recovery was still fragile. Humanity remained genetically narrow and geographically uneven, confined largely to surviving pockets within Africa. Yet the species was no longer only enduring environmental pressure. It was rebuilding social complexity, expanding cultural behavior, and rediscovering movement across larger territories. Within these recovering populations existed the beginnings of every migration, settlement, language, family, and civilization that would eventually follow, carried quietly forward by people who had emerged from one of the darkest passages in human history. At some point between 70,000 and 60,000 years ago, small groups of humans began moving beyond the continent where our species first emerged. The movement was gradual, almost certainly unfolding across generations rather than as a single journey. Families followed coastlines, river valleys, and familiar animal paths into territories no Homo sapiens population had permanently occupied before. From those quiet migrations came every non-African population alive today. Genetics preserves the outline of this expansion with remarkable clarity. People living outside Africa share patterns of inherited variation pointing back to one primary founding population from this era. However diverse modern societies appear on the surface, the deeper genetic structure beneath them narrows toward a surprisingly small ancestral group. The descendants of those travelers eventually spread across nearly every environment on Earth, yet their origins trace back to only a limited number of survivors emerging from Africa after the bottleneck. Exactly how they left remains uncertain. Some researchers favor a northern route through the Sinai Peninsula into the Levant, following corridors shaped by shifting climates and temporary grasslands. Others support a southern crossing at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait near the southern end of the Red Sea. During glacial periods, sea levels were lower than today, narrowing the water crossing significantly. In certain phases, it may have been only a fraction of its modern width, making movement into Arabia more feasible for small coastal populations familiar with marine environments. The southern route attracts particular interest because it aligns closely with evidence for coastal adaptation among the surviving African populations. Groups accustomed to shoreline living may have expanded naturally along connected coastal ecosystems stretching into Arabia, India, and beyond. These migrants were not entering empty lands, however. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly other archaic human populations already occupied large portions of Eurasia. The expansion of Homo sapiens became not only a migration, but an encounter between different branches of humanity. The founding population leaving Africa was itself already shaped by the earlier bottleneck. Non-African populations therefore carry an even narrower slice of human genetic diversity than populations remaining within Africa. Geneticists describe this as a second bottleneck layered upon the first. Estimates vary, but some models suggest the original migrant groups may have numbered only in the hundreds or low thousands. Such a small population carrying the future of global humanity would normally appear improbably fragile. Yet movement itself can become a survival strategy. Expanding into new territories reduces competition for resources while creating opportunities for isolated populations to grow. Over thousands of years, descendants of these migrants adapted to deserts, mountains, forests, coastlines, and eventually frozen northern environments far beyond the ecological settings where Homo sapiens first evolved. The speed of the expansion remains one of the most extraordinary demographic events in natural history. Humans reached Australia by approximately 50,000 years ago, requiring open water crossings into Sahul long before recorded history. By 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens occupied parts of Europe alongside declining Neanderthal populations. Eventually, after many additional millennia, humans crossed into the Americas by at least 15,000 years ago, spreading across entirely new continents. All of this unfolded from populations still small enough to remain vulnerable to disease, famine, and environmental instability. The migration outward from Africa was therefore not a triumphant march carried by enormous numbers. It was a gradual diffusion of scattered communities whose descendants slowly filled the world, generation after generation, until nearly every habitable landscape carried traces of their arrival. Beyond the coastlines of Southeast Asia lay a horizon unlike any humans had faced before. Even during periods when sea levels were far lower than today, deep channels of open water still separated the Asian continent from the landmass archaeologists call Sahul, the connected Ice Age continent formed by Australia and New Guinea. Reaching it required something humanity had likely never attempted on such a scale before: deliberate travel across open ocean. The earliest confirmed evidence for human presence in Australia dates to roughly 50,000 to 65,000 years ago. This means that within perhaps only 10,000 or 20,000 years after leaving Africa, descendants of the bottleneck survivors had already reached an entirely separate continent. The pace of the migration is astonishing when measured against the tiny populations from which it began. The crossing itself could not have been accidental. Even with lowered seas exposing additional coastline, travelers still needed to navigate stretches of water at least 70 to 90 kilometers wide. The far shore would not always have remained visible from departure points. Small groups, therefore, had to organize movement intentionally, carrying tools, food, water, and likely children across unstable currents into unknown territory. Such voyages imply remarkable cognitive and social abilities. Watercraft had to be constructed from available materials and maintained well enough to survive the journey. Groups required coordination, planning, and communication sophisticated enough to organize departures and sustain cooperation during dangerous crossings. Navigation also demanded careful observation of coastlines, weather, tides, and perhaps even bird movements or ocean swells. These were not isolated wanderers drifting accidentally into new lands. They were people capable of imagining destinations beyond the visible horizon. At Majid Bebe Rock Shelter in Australia's Northern Territory, archaeologists uncovered artifacts dating to approximately 65,000 years ago. The site contains grinding stones, ochre pigments, reflective materials, and carefully shaped tools associated with the earliest known occupation layers. The evidence suggests that the first people arriving in Sahul already carried complex cultural traditions with them. Symbolic behavior technological skill, and structured social life had crossed the ocean alongside human bodies. Genetics preserves another layer of the journey. Aboriginal Australians today carry signatures tracing back to those ancient migrations, along with traces of Denisovan ancestry inherited through encounters somewhere in Southeast Asia before the crossing into Sahul. Long before written history, different human lineages met, exchanged genes, and continued onward through changing landscapes stretching from Africa to the Pacific. Once established in Australia, these populations became increasingly isolated from the rest of the world as rising seas later submerged the land bridges connecting Sahul to surrounding regions. That separation helped preserve one of the oldest continuous cultural traditions on Earth. Aboriginal Australian cultures endured across deserts, tropical coasts, grasslands, and river systems for more than 50,000 years, maintaining deep connections to land, memory, and oral tradition across spans of time almost impossible to comprehend fully. The people who first crossed into Australia carried within them the compressed inheritance of a species that had nearly vanished. Their ancestors had survived environmental collapse, shrinking populations, and generations of isolation before beginning the long expansion outward from Africa. The memory of those hardships may not have survived as stories in any recognizable form, yet culturally and biologically, the migration into Sahul still unfolded in the shadow of that earlier narrowing. Humanity's first great ocean crossing emerged not from abundance or security, but from small, resilient populations continuing to move forward into landscapes no human eyes had ever seen before. For most of human history, Denisovans were completely unknown. No legends remembered them, no visible ruins carried their name, and no clear fossils announced their existence to science. Their discovery began instead with something astonishingly small, a fragment of finger bone uncovered in Denisova Cave within the Altai Mountains of Siberia. In 2010, researchers extracted ancient DNA from the bone and realized it belonged neither to Neanderthals nor to modern humans, but to an entirely different human lineage. The discovery transformed paleoanthropology almost immediately. Earlier, human species had always been identified first through bones, skulls, or skeletons. Denisovans emerged through genetics alone, recognized initially not by anatomy, but by sequences of nucleotides preserved within ancient cells for tens of thousands of years. It was the first time an extinct branch of humanity had been identified primarily through DNA rather than physical appearance. Although direct fossil evidence remains sparse, genetic traces reveal that Denisovans occupied an enormous territory stretching across Asia. Their populations likely ranged from the cold forests of Siberia to warmer environments deep within Southeast Asia. During their expansion across Eurasia, Homo sapiens encountered Denisovans repeatedly, just as they encountered Neanderthals farther west. These meetings were not always hostile or distant. Interbreeding occurred often enough that living people today still carry inherited fragments of Denisovan DNA. The strongest Denisovan genetic signals appear among Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian populations, where approximately 4 to 6% of the genome traces back to Denisovan ancestors. This inheritance suggests that the ancestors of these populations encountered Denisovans somewhere in Southeast Asia before continuing toward Sahul. Long after Denisovan populations themselves disappeared, portions of their biology continued traveling through human generations. Some inherited traits proved especially important for survival. Tibetan populations today carry a Denisovan-derived variant of the EPAS1 gene, which helps regulate the body's response to low oxygen conditions at high altitude. In the thin air of the Himalayan plateau, this adaptation allows more efficient oxygen use while reducing harmful physiological stress. The gene entered Homo sapiens populations through ancient interbreeding and later spread because it improved survival in extreme environments. Denisovans themselves were likely diverse in appearance and adaptation. A jawbone discovered on the Tibetan plateau and fossil teeth recovered from Laos suggest populations living across dramatically different climates and elevations. These scattered remains hint at a lineage far more widespread than scientists first imagined after the Siberian discovery. Some Denisovan groups may have adapted to freezing mountain environments, while others inhabited humid tropical forests thousands of kilometers away. Like Neanderthals, Denisovans eventually disappeared as distinct populations. The reasons remain uncertain. Climate change, competition, low population numbers, and absorption into expanding Homo sapiens groups may all have contributed. Yet extinction in this case was not complete erasure. Their genes remain present within millions of living people, quietly influencing biology long after the populations themselves vanished from the archaeological record. As Homo sapiens expanded outward after surviving near extinction, the species entered a world already inhabited by other humans, shaped through hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution. Encounters with Denisovans and Neanderthals reveal that humanity's story was never a solitary march across empty continents. It was a long mingling of related lineages, converging and separating across prehistoric landscapes before only one human species ultimately remained widespread across the Earth. When populations become extremely small, evolution begins behaving differently. In large populations, genetic variation spreads across millions of individuals, allowing unusual traits to remain rare for long periods without disappearing entirely. During a bottleneck, that balance changes. Chance itself starts shaping the future of the species with unusual force, preserving some traits while erasing others almost at random. Geneticists call this process genetic drift. In a large population, a rare genetic variant may persist quietly for thousands of generations because enough individuals carry it. In a tiny population, the same variant can vanish completely if the few people possessing it fail to survive or reproduce. Conversely, a trait once uncommon can suddenly become widespread simply because the survivors happened to carry it. Evolution during a bottleneck, therefore, becomes partly a matter of contingency, the future shaped not only by adaptation, but by which individuals remained alive at the narrowest point. Some researchers believe the human bottleneck may have intensified the spread of certain beneficial traits that later became nearly universal among Homo sapiens. Variants associated with cognition, communication, and social behavior may have passed through the bottleneck in unusually concentrated form, carried by the small populations that eventually repopulated the world. One often discussed example involves the FOXP2 gene, associated with the fine motor coordination necessary for speech and language production. Modern humans carry a version distinct from that found in chimpanzees, and the remarkable consistency of this variant across humanity suggests it became widespread early in our species' history. Scientists remain cautious about linking any single gene directly to language itself, yet the near universality of FOXP2 within Homo sapiens fits the broader pattern expected from a severe bottleneck where certain inherited traits spread rapidly through small surviving populations. The immune system also bears signs of this narrowing. Human immune gene diversity is lower than might be expected for a species now numbering in the billions. Reduced diversity creates complicated consequences. On one hand, limited variation can increase vulnerability to unfamiliar pathogens because populations share similar biological weaknesses. On the other, greater genetic similarity can also produce more standardized immune responses across large groups of people. The bottleneck therefore shaped not only how humans think and communicate, but how human bodies respond to disease itself. Some researchers extend this idea further into cognition and behavior. The near universal human capacities for symbolic thought, long term planning, language acquisition, storytelling, and abstract reasoning may reflect more than gradual evolutionary pressure alone. They may also reflect the genetic homogenization created when only a small subset of earlier human diversity survived. Humanity today could represent countless variations built upon a surprisingly narrow, inherited foundation. Yet every trait preserved during the bottleneck implies countless others were lost. Entire genetic lineages vanished permanently as populations disappeared across Africa and Eurasia. Adaptations that might have helped resist disease, tolerate environmental extremes, or shape cognition in unfamiliar ways may have existed in the humans who left no descendants. Those possibilities remain unknowable because the genes themselves vanished with the populations carrying them. Modern humanity, therefore, carries both inheritance and absence within its genome. Certain traits became amplified because survival narrowed the species into small, interconnected lineages. Other possibilities disappeared forever before recorded history began. The bottleneck did not simply reduce the number of humans alive. It reshaped the biological architecture of every future generation, compressing humanity into a smaller set of surviving variations that still echoes quietly within all living people today. Morning mist often settles softly across Lake Toba before the sun fully reaches the water. From the surrounding hills, the lake appears calm and immense, its surface stretching so far that the edges dissolve into pale blue distance. Fishing boats drift quietly across the volcanic basin, and villages rest along the shoreline beneath steep green slopes. It is difficult, standing there today, to imagine that this tranquil expanse was born from one of the most violent geological events in the history of our species. The lake itself occupies the collapsed center of the ancient eruption. The caldera extends roughly 100 kilometers in length and 30 kilometers in width, large enough to dominate the landscape of northern Sumatra entirely. In some places, the water reaches depths of more than 500 meters, making it one of the deepest volcanic lakes on Earth. The scale feels less like a crater and more like an inland sea, a hollow left behind after unimaginable volumes of magma emptied from beneath the surface and the land above folded inward under its own weight. At the center of the lake rises Samusur Island, enormous enough to seem like a separate world within the caldera. The island itself was lifted upward after the eruption as magma slowly pushed beneath the collapsed basin again, raising the earth over thousands of years. Samusur is larger than modern Singapore, a reminder that the forces beneath Toba never fully disappeared. Even after 70,000 years, the landscape is still adjusting to the violence that created it. Communities have lived around Lake Toba for countless generations. Among them are the Batak people, whose traditions include stories of floods, upheaval, and transformations of the land. Some researchers have cautiously wondered whether fragments of ancient volcanic memory survived within these oral histories, passed quietly across centuries through storytelling and ritual. No scientific evidence can confirm such a connection, and many scholars remain skeptical, yet the possibility lingers gently beside the lake itself, where geology and human memory occupy the same terrain. Beneath the calm water, The magma system remains active. Toba is classified as a resurgent caldera, meaning the underground chamber still contains molten material capable of deforming the surface above it. Satellite measurements and geological monitoring show that portions of the caldera continue rising gradually over time. Volcanologists maintain constant observation because even a much smaller eruption today would have enormous consequences in a densely populated region connected to the global climate and economy. The ancient eruption also transformed distant lands in quieter ways. Ash, carried across South Asia, settled into soils that, over centuries, became exceptionally fertile. Minerals released from volcanic material enriched river valleys and agricultural plains across parts of the Indian subcontinent. Rice fields, forests, and some of the most productive farmland in Asia now rest partly upon the remnants of that catastrophe, nourished by material once blasted into the sky during the near collapse of human populations. There is a strange continuity in that transformation. The eruption that darkened skies, fractured ecosystems, and narrowed humanity to scattered survivors also altered the Earth in ways that later supported immense civilizations. Billions of people now live upon landscapes shaped directly or indirectly by the aftermath of Toba. The crater remains, the magma still stirs below, and the descendants of those fragile survivors continue building their lives around the edges of the ancient wound. Long before the eruption at Toba darkened the atmosphere, another silence seems to have passed across the human story. It lies much deeper in time, nearly 1 million years ago, where the fossil record thins and entire stretches of ancestry fade into uncertainty. In caves, river sediments, and ancient lake deposits across Africa, there are periods where the traces of early humans become unexpectedly scarce, as though populations contracted into scattered fragments that left only faint impressions behind. A study published in 2023 using a genomic method called FitCol suggested that this disappearance in the record may reflect a second, far older population collapse. According to the analysis, the ancestors of modern humans may have declined to fewer than 1,300 breeding individuals between roughly 900,000 and 800,000 years ago. Even more striking was the proposed duration. Rather than a sudden catastrophe lasting a few generations, this bottleneck may have persisted for approximately 117,000 years, stretching across spans of time so vast that entire landscapes would have transformed repeatedly around the survivors. The African climate during this period appears to have been unstable and shifting. Cycles of cooling and warming altered rainfall patterns across the continent, changing forests into grasslands and then back again over thousands of years. Lakes expanded and disappeared. Rivers changed course. Habitats that once connected populations may have fractured into isolated ecological islands separated by inhospitable terrain. Small human groups living within these fragmented regions would have struggled to maintain contact, and isolation itself can become a quiet evolutionary force, narrowing genetic exchange generation after generation. This older bottleneck also overlaps with one of the most mysterious intervals in paleoanthropology. Between approximately 900,000 and 600,000 years ago, hominin fossils in Africa become surprisingly rare. Researchers debate whether this reflects an actual demographic collapse or simply the incompleteness of the fossil record, yet the absence remains striking. It is within the shadow of this uncertain period that Homo heidelbergensis eventually emerged, a species widely considered the likely common ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans. Seen from this perspective, Homo heidelbergensis may represent not merely a new branch of humanity, but the gradual recovery of a lineage that had already endured a prolonged narrowing. Populations expanded again, diversified across continents, and eventually separated into multiple human forms adapted to different environments. Much later, after another immense interval of time, the descendants of one of those branches would face the volcanic winter associated with Toba and pass through yet another severe reduction in numbers. The human lineage, therefore, appears shaped not by uninterrupted success, but by repeated episodes of contraction and survival. Diversity was reduced again and again, each bottleneck acting like a narrowing channel through which only part of the ancestral variation could pass. Certain traits persisted because the individuals carrying them happened to survive. Other traits vanished permanently with populations that left no descendants. Across nearly 1 million years, our ancestors endured climatic upheaval, environmental fragmentation, volcanic catastrophe, and prolonged isolation. The continuity connecting modern humanity to those distant populations was never guaranteed. It survived through repeated intervals when extinction stood close beside survival, and when the future of the human story rested within groups small enough to disappear into the landscape around them. Across forests, oceans, grasslands, and polar coasts, biology preserves quiet records of species that pass through dangerous narrowing points. Some vanished entirely, others survived, though altered permanently by the reduction in their numbers. Conservation scientists study these patterns not only to understand endangered animals living today, but also to reconstruct how fragile populations behave when chance, environment, and genetics begin pressing against one another all at once. One of the central ideas in conservation biology is the concept of minimum viable population. Below a certain population size, survival becomes increasingly unstable. Inbreeding accumulates across generations. Harmful recessive traits become more common, and genetic diversity declines until adaptation itself becomes more difficult. Random events that a larger population could absorb, a drought, an epidemic, a poor breeding season, suddenly carry the potential to erase entire lineages. Researchers sometimes describe this process as an extinction vortex, a slow tightening cycle in which biological weakness and environmental pressure reinforce one another over time. For large mammals, the estimated threshold for long-term survival often falls somewhere between several hundred and several thousand breeding individuals, depending on the species and the stability of the habitat. The estimated human populations during the ancient bottlenecks discussed by geneticists approach this same dangerous boundary. In some models, they may even fall below it, placing our ancestors within population ranges that modern conservation science would classify as critically vulnerable. The living world still contains examples of what such reductions can do to a species. Cheetahs, for instance, experienced a severe bottleneck approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Modern cheetahs are so genetically similar that skin grafts between unrelated individuals are often accepted by the immune system, a level of compatibility more typical of identical twins than separate animals. Their bodies still carry the biological signature of an ancient collapse that compressed their genetic variation into a remarkably narrow range. Northern elephant seals offer another example, though much more recent. In the 19th century, commercial hunting reduced their numbers to perhaps only 20 or 30 surviving individuals along remote coastlines. Today, their population has recovered to more than 170,000, filling beaches once again with enormous breeding colonies. Yet, despite their numerical recovery, The genetic diversity lost during that crash was never restored. Every living northern elephant seal now descends from that tiny remnant population hidden along the Pacific shore. Humans share some of these same signatures. Compared with many other mammals, especially great apes, our species displays unusually low genetic variation, yet something about human survival unfolded differently. Despite severe narrowing events, humans retained enough adaptability to expand across nearly every environment on Earth within a relatively brief evolutionary period. The precise reasons remain uncertain, though many researchers believe cultural transmission played a decisive role. Unlike most species, humans do not rely solely on instinct, inherited biologically from parent to offspring. Knowledge itself can survive independently inside a community. A method for shaping stone, locating seasonal water, preserving food, reading coastlines, or navigating migration routes can pass from one generation to the next through memory, imitation, and teaching. Even when populations become dangerously small, accumulated experience does not vanish automatically with each death. Skills remain distributed across minds, carried collectively rather than individually. In that sense, survival may have depended not only on bodies enduring harsh conditions, but on stories, habits, and learned behaviors remaining unbroken across generations, small enough to fit within a single hidden refuge. In small populations pressed against the edge of survival, biology moves with deep patience. Genetic change unfolds slowly across many generations, shaped by birth, death, inheritance, and chance. A useful mutation may require thousands of years to spread widely through a species. Yet humans possessed another system of adaptation, moving at an entirely different speed, one capable of changing behavior almost immediately through memory, imitation, and shared experience. A new technique for sharpening stone, preserving edible plants, storing embers through cold nights, or locating hidden freshwater springs could pass from one person to another within days. Unlike genetic evolution, cultural evolution does not wait for reproduction. It travels through observation and teaching, carried in gestures, sounds, routines, and repeated acts around shelter fires. During periods of ecological collapse, this capacity may have become one of the decisive forces separating survival from disappearance. Archaeological evidence from refugia sites along the southern African coast suggests that human cultural activity did not simply endure through the harsh climatic instability surrounding Toba. In several ways, it appears to have intensified. At Pinnacle Point and nearby locations, researchers found evidence of increasingly refined stone technologies, deliberate pigment processing, and systematic use of coastal resources during periods associated with severe environmental stress. Rather than retreating into behavioral simplicity, these populations may have become more inventive as conditions narrowed around them. Researchers in cognitive archaeology attempt to reconstruct ancient patterns of thought through the objects early humans left behind. A shaped blade, a prepared adhesive, or a repeated geometric engraving reflects sequences of planning invisible in the artifact itself. To create a hafted tool, for example, required gathering different raw materials from separate environments, preparing adhesives through controlled heating, shaping wooden shafts, and binding components together in the correct order. Each step depended on foresight and procedural memory extending beyond immediate survival. The refinement of hafted tools during this period represents more than technological improvement. It reflects minds capable of combining multiple processes into coordinated systems. Adhesives made from plant resins mixed with powdered ochre required careful temperature control during preparation. Experimental archaeology has shown that overheating these compounds ruins them entirely, while insufficient heat leaves them ineffective. Such techniques imply accumulated practical knowledge transmitted reliably across generations living within unstable environments. Fire stood at the center of much of this adaptation. Long before the volcanic winter, humans had already mastered controlled burning for warmth, cooking, protection, and landscape management. During colder and darker periods, following major climatic disruptions, fire likely became even more essential. It transformed tough foods into digestible nutrition, extended activity beyond daylight hours, hardened wooden tools, and created protected spaces within otherwise dangerous surroundings. The persistence of fire knowledge alone may have preserved entire communities during prolonged environmental stress. Equally important was cooperation itself. Small human groups depended on coordinated social behavior at nearly every level of survival. Food sharing reduced the risk carried by unsuccessful hunts. Collective childcare protected vulnerable infants during periods of scarcity. Knowledge distributed across many individuals prevented essential skills from disappearing when one person died. Groups fractured by conflict or weakened by isolation may have vanished quickly, while groups capable of maintaining trust and communication endured. In this sense, human survival was not shaped solely by stronger bodies or favorable geography. It was also shaped by the ability to accumulate understanding collectively, preserving fragile networks of knowledge across generations, small enough to disappear from the earth almost without trace. Voices vanish more completely than footprints. A campfire can stain stone for thousands of years, and a shaped blade may rest undisturbed beneath layers of earth long after its maker disappears, yet spoken words dissolve instantly into air. Because of this, the origin of language remains one of the most difficult mysteries in human science. Researchers approach it indirectly, studying the anatomy of ancient skulls, the genetics associated with speech, and the growing complexity of symbolic behavior preserved within archaeological sites scattered across Africa and Eurasia. Somewhere before the great population collapse associated with Toba, human communication had already advanced far beyond simple calls or gestures. Groups coordinated hunts, shared knowledge of dangerous landscapes, taught children tool-making techniques, and maintained social bonds across generations. Whether language at that time was fully modern or still developing remains uncertain, yet the bottleneck introduces an extraordinary possibility. If only a few thousand humans survived, then every conversation spoken today ultimately descends from the communication systems carried by those survivors through the long ecological crisis. If fully symbolic language already existed before the eruption, it endured through isolation and scarcity like embers preserved beneath ash. Entire forms of speech may have disappeared, with populations that left no descendants. Sounds, stories, naming traditions, and systems of meaning could have vanished silently as groups failed one by one across collapsing environments. The linguistic inheritance of humanity would therefore represent only a surviving fragment of a much larger world of ancient expression. Other researchers suggest the pressures surrounding the bottleneck may actually have accelerated language development. Small populations living in dangerous and unstable conditions depended heavily on precise communication. Survival required remembering seasonal patterns, describing distant water sources, organizing cooperative gathering along coastlines, and warning others about shifting environmental dangers. Groups capable of sharing detailed, abstract information efficiently would have possessed powerful advantages over groups limited to simpler communication systems. Linguists note that isolated communities often change language rapidly because every member interacts closely and continuously with every other member. During the refugia period, human populations may have consisted of intensely connected bands separated from outsiders for countless generations. Within such environments, speech could evolve quickly, refining grammar, expanding vocabulary, and strengthening the ability to express increasingly complex thoughts about time, planning, and social relationships. Despite the extraordinary diversity of modern languages, researchers continue finding deep structural similarities beneath their surface differences. Every known language contains ways of organizing actions, objects, intentions, and relationships. All human languages allow speakers to build larger meanings from smaller components, embedding thoughts within thoughts through recursive structure. These universal patterns suggest a shared cognitive foundation inherited from common ancestors living long before the migrations out of Africa. Some scholars have cautiously explored whether traces of extremely ancient speech patterns might survive within the languages of southern African populations connected genetically to proposed refugia regions. The San languages are especially remarkable for their use of click consonants, among the most phonetically intricate sounds used anywhere in human speech. No evidence proves these sounds preserve direct echoes from the bottleneck era, yet their complexity offers a reminder of how ancient and varied human language may already have been. Across the narrowing centuries after Toba, language became more than communication alone. It allowed memory to survive independently from individuals, carrying practical knowledge, shared identity, and accumulated understanding forward through generations small enough to vanish entirely within a hostile world. At some forgotten moment along a southern shoreline, perhaps beside tide pools exposed beneath a pale morning sky, the entire future of humanity may have existed within a population smaller than a modern village. The number remains uncertain, shifting with each new genetic model and analytical method. Yet, several studies suggest the breeding population of Homo sapiens may once have fallen to roughly 1,280 individuals. Every city now standing, every language spoken, every orbiting satellite and illuminated harbor traces backward through that astonishingly narrow passage in time. Recovery came slowly enough that no survivor could have perceived it. Generations passed with the world still feeling sparse and dangerous. Human groups spread cautiously along coasts, rivers, and grasslands reopening after long climatic instability. Children inherited landscapes carrying the memory of ecological collapse, even when vegetation had begun returning and animal migrations had stabilized once more. Population growth during this immense span remained fragile, interrupted by droughts, disease, and local failures that could erase entire communities before they left any permanent mark in the archaeological record. By approximately 12,000 years ago, after tens of thousands of years of wandering expansion across Africa, Eurasia, and Australia, the total human population may finally have approached between 5 and 10 million individuals. Even that number remained tiny compared with the abundance surrounding humanity today. Most people lived in small kin groups, moving seasonally across territories shaped by weather, migration routes, and the rhythms of wild plants. Then another transformation emerged independently in several regions of the world. In river valleys and fertile plains enriched by ancient sediments, humans began cultivating grasses, storing grain, and domesticating animals. Agriculture altered the relationship between people and land more profoundly than any previous innovation. settlements became permanent. Food surpluses allowed larger families to survive. Villages widened into towns, and towns slowly hardened into the first cities. Population growth accelerated with a force unseen in earlier human history. By 5,000 years ago, humanity may already have numbered around 50 million. Forests receded before farming, irrigation spread across floodplains, and trade routes linked distant populations that had once lived in near total isolation. The descendants of the bottleneck survivors were no longer scattered remnants clinging to ecological refuges. They had become a planetary species, reshaping entire environments. Yet even this expansion remained modest compared with what followed. Around the year 1800, the global human population reached approximately 1 billion. Fossil fuels, industrial machinery, modern sanitation, and scientific medicine then compressed demographic change into a period shorter than the span separating the present from the Roman Empire. In barely 220 years, humanity expanded from 1 billion to more than 8 billion people. The improbability of this trajectory is difficult for the mind to fully absorb. Every living person descends through an uninterrupted chain of births, each generation linked to ancestors who endured famine, storms, predators, infections, migrations, and volcanic winters stretching back into prehistory. The genetic legacy of the bottleneck still remains inside us, visible in our relative similarity to one another compared with many other species, and perhaps reflected in shared patterns of emotion, cognition, and vulnerability carried across continents. Nothing about this recovery was guaranteed. It depended upon countless acts of cooperation, adaptation, memory, and fortune repeated over tens of thousands of years. The world inhabited by billions today emerged gradually from the persistence of a few cold survivors who once stood near the edge of disappearance, holding on to life beside a darkened sea. Imagine the shoreline falling silent at last, the last cooking fires cooling into ash beneath coastal stone overhangs, the final footprints erased by tides moving patiently beneath a dim sky. Somewhere within those scattered refuges, perhaps among only a few surviving bands of Homo sapiens, the thread of our species narrowed to almost nothing. A failed season of shellfish gathering, an unfamiliar sickness moving through exhausted communities, another climatic shock arriving before recovery had begun, any of these might have ended the story completely. Extinction would not have been unusual. The Earth had already witnessed the disappearance of countless human relatives long before our own rise. Homo erectus endured for more than 1 million years before vanishing. Other branches of humanity emerged, adapted, spread, and disappeared again into deep time, leaving fragments of bone and stone buried beneath sediment. If the survivors of the volcanic winter had also vanished, Homo sapiens would likely be known today only through scattered fossils resting beneath African soil, one more unfinished experiment in human evolution. The world itself would have remained inhabited by intelligent beings. Neanderthals continued living across Europe and Western Asia during this period, enduring cold climates with remarkable resilience. Denisovans ranged across enormous territories, stretching from Siberia into Southeast Asia. Both groups crafted tools, controlled fire, hunted cooperatively, and adapted to difficult environments with clear behavioral sophistication. Ancient DNA now reveals that these populations were not evolutionary dead ends stumbling blindly through prehistory, but humans in every meaningful biological sense except taxonomy. Whether Neanderthals or Denisovans might eventually have developed agriculture, cities, astronomy, metallurgy, or written language cannot be answered. Their extinction came much later, after encounters and interbreeding with expanding Homo sapiens populations. No evidence suggests an absence of intelligence sufficient to prevent cultural complexity from deepening over time. The future they might have built remains permanently unknowable because our own ancestors survived long enough to alter the outcome. Without Homo sapiens spreading outward across every continent, the living world would likely look profoundly different. Mammoths would still move across northern grasslands beneath cold winds. Giant ground sloths might still browse through American forests. Australia could still belong to towering marsupials and immense reptiles that disappeared soon after human arrival. North America would still carry native horses and camels grazing across open plains. The great wave of megafaunal extinctions following human expansion might never have unfolded at all. The atmosphere itself would also be different. No fields cut into forests for agriculture. No industrial cities burning coal into the sky. No global network of machines releasing carbon stored underground for hundreds of millions of years. Rivers would still follow older courses through unengineered floodplains. Many coastlines would remain untouched except by storms, tides, and migrating animals. This is not an argument for a better or worse Earth. It is only a reminder of contingency, the quiet instability beneath every outcome that later appears inevitable. The modern world, with its crowded continents and illuminated nights visible from orbit, emerged from a sequence of survivals so fragile that another ending remained possible for thousands of years. Everything familiar today, every culture, every language, every memory carried within living minds, depends upon the endurance of a few vulnerable communities who once survived beside an ancient sea while much of the world grew dark around them. Inside every living human cell, tucked within microscopic structures that quietly convert oxygen into energy, there exists a genetic thread older than nations, older than agriculture, older than memory itself. Mitochondrial DNA passes almost unchanged from mother to child across immense spans of time, drifting through generations like a hidden current beneath history. The mitochondria within your body contain molecular patterns inherited through an unbroken maternal chain reaching back more than 70,000 years to women who endured one of the harshest chapters our species has ever faced. This is not poetry layered over science. It is measurable biological continuity. Genetic sequencing can trace these maternal lineages backward through populations and continents, revealing relationships invisible to ordinary experience. Every living person carries fragments of information shaped within those surviving communities who persisted after climatic collapse and ecological devastation narrowed humanity toward extinction. The mathematics of ancestry deepens the strangeness further. Genealogically, each person possesses an exploding number of ancestors as generations unfold backward through time. 10 generations ago alone, the theoretical number already exceeds 1,000 individuals. Farther back, the count becomes impossibly vast, overlapping repeatedly because distant relatives shared common ancestors. Yet, genetic inheritance behaves differently. Most genealogical ancestors eventually leave no detectable DNA within a living descendant. Their biological contribution fades through recombination until no identifiable fragment remains. The bottleneck survivors are different because their populations became foundational to all later humans. Their genes spread through every branch of humanity that followed, surviving repeated migrations, expansions, and cultural transformations. Across billions of people alive today, the signal of those ancient survivors still persists. Beneath all visible differences in language, appearance, and geography lies a striking biological closeness. evidence of how narrowly our lineage once passed through time. It is impossible to know precisely what those survivors believed about the altered world around them. They possessed no written records, no astronomy, no understanding of volcanic aerosols or population genetics. They did not stand on the shoreline imagining future civilizations. They were simply human beings responding to immediate realities, searching for food, protecting children, tending fires against cold winds, adapting day by day to landscapes transformed beyond recognition. Perhaps grief moved quietly through their camps as familiar hunting grounds emptied and older travel routes became impossible. Perhaps stories changed as generations passed, preserving fragments of vanished environments no child alive had ever seen. The survivors themselves could not have known how few humans remained elsewhere. For all they understood, the world may simply have felt larger, emptier, and more silent than before. Their endurance depended upon countless fragile circumstances aligning at once. A cave remained dry during heavy rains. Coastal springs continued flowing. Shellfish beds replenished with the tides. An infection spared one child and carried away another. A hunting injury healed instead of turning fatal. Knowledge passed successfully between generations before an elder died. Small contingencies accumulated quietly until survival continued one more season, then another. Science often reveals patterns governed partly by chance, and few discoveries express this more clearly than the human bottleneck. Our existence does not emerge from inevitability or destiny written into the structure of the universe. The people who carried humanity forward were not necessarily stronger, wiser, or more advanced than those who disappeared. They were the ones who happened to remain alive long enough for history to continue through them. Every human life now unfolds at the far end of that uninterrupted chain, connected invisibly to those ancient survivors beside the sea, whose ordinary acts of endurance became the foundation for everyone who came afterward. Across deserts, islands, forests, and immense modern cities, humanity often appears divided into countless categories of language, appearance, ancestry, and belief. Yet beneath those visible differences, genetics reveals something unexpectedly intimate. The ancient bottleneck left a permanent signature inside every living person, evidence that all humans alive today descend from an extraordinarily small population that survived while our species hovered near extinction. Modern genomic research has shown with remarkable consistency that human beings are genetically very similar to one another. Two people born on opposite sides of the planet still share the overwhelming majority of their DNA. The variations that do exist are small, gradual, and overlapping. Skin color changes with latitude and sunlight exposure. Facial traits shift subtly across geography. Hair texture, body proportions, and other visible characteristics reflect local adaptations accumulated over relatively recent evolutionary time. None of these traits divide humanity into clear biological categories. This is one reason modern genetics found little support for the older concept of biological race. Human genetic variation is continuous rather than sharply separated. In fact, the genetic differences between populations are tiny compared with the variation found inside many other animal species. Two neighboring chimpanzee groups living in the same forest can possess greater genetic diversity than human populations separated by oceans and continents. Our species is biologically unusual in how closely related it is to itself. Part of that closeness emerged through loss. Before the bottleneck, earlier human populations likely carried far greater genetic diversity than exists today. Many ancient lineages disappeared during periods of climatic stress, ecological collapse, and demographic contraction. Their descendants never survived long enough to contribute substantially to the future human population. What remains is only a surviving fragment of a once broader spectrum of humanity. The deepest roots of that surviving fragment are African. Genetic studies consistently show that African populations contain the greatest diversity found anywhere on Earth. This pattern reflects humanity's long evolutionary history on the African continent and the fact that the groups who later migrated outward represented only a subset of the populations already living there. When small founding groups crossed into Arabia and Eurasia, they carried with them only part of the variation present in Africa. As humans expanded across the world, additional founder effects narrowed diversity further. Small migrating bands settled new regions, one after another, each population carrying only a limited sample of the genes present in the previous one. Yet, despite these repeated bottlenecks, all humans remained extraordinarily close relatives in evolutionary terms. The traces of shared ancestry remain visible across every genome studied today. There is something quietly humbling in this realization. Every civilization, empire, religion, language, family, and cultural tradition emerged from populations connected through a recent common history, still measurable inside living cells. The memory of near extinction survives not as a preserved story, but as a biological pattern carried invisibly through generations. And still, from that narrow genetic foundation came astonishing cultural richness. Thousands of languages developed, each with distinct sounds and structures. Music, mathematics, mythology, architecture, ritual, and philosophy unfolded differently across continents, despite arising from populations sharing nearly identical biological inheritance. Cultural diversity expanded far beyond genetic diversity. The bottleneck leaves behind a profound truth about our species. Biologically, humanity is one extended family shaped by survival through deep time. The differences people often treat as vast are, in evolutionary terms, extraordinarily small. Beneath every border and every inherited identity lies the same ancient continuity carried forward from a few vulnerable communities who survived long enough for the entire human story to continue. Beneath the calm appearance of the modern world, the deeper history of life carries a quieter and far more uncertain rhythm. Species emerge, spread, flourish for stretches of time beyond ordinary imagination, then disappear. Entire ecosystems rise and vanish like weather patterns written across millions of years. The near extinction of Homo sapiens, approximately 70,000 years ago, belongs to that larger pattern, not as an exception to nature, but as one more narrow passage through it. Paleontologists identify at least 5 great mass extinctions in Earth's history. Each one erased most living species of its age. Ancient oceans emptied of familiar life. Forest systems collapsed. Dominant creatures that had survived for millions of years disappeared into stone and memoryless sediment. Yet after every catastrophe, over spans so vast they almost escape comprehension, new forms appeared. Ecological space opened. Evolution began experimenting again. The Permian extinction, around 252 million years ago, remains the most severe event known from the fossil record. An estimated 96% of marine species vanished, along with roughly 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. Reef ecosystems that had flourished for ages dissolved into barren seafloors. Entire evolutionary branches ended permanently. The Earth afterward would have looked stripped and strangely empty compared to the living abundance that came before. Yet, life persisted in scattered remnants. Over millions of years, new forests spread across recovering continents, reptiles diversified into unfamiliar forms, and biological complexity slowly returned. Humanity's own bottleneck was a smaller echo of this same recurring process. Our species contracted to a tiny surviving population, perhaps no larger than a modest village by modern standards. Diversity narrowed. Human groups vanished from large portions of the landscape. The continuity of our existence balanced on fragile chains of successful births, passing seasons, and shelters that remained habitable while surrounding regions failed. Then, gradually, expansion resumed. The pattern was reduction, followed by recovery, silence, followed by renewal. None of this suggests survival is guaranteed. The history of life offers no such promise. Most species that have existed are gone forever. Extinction is not an anomaly within evolution. It is one of evolution's central realities. Yet the same history also reveals something else, a repeated tendency for life to endure through astonishing instability. Small populations survive in isolated refuges. Organisms adapt to altered climates. Ecosystems rebuild from fragments that seemed too damaged to continue. Even Toba itself emerged from processes inseparable from the long maintenance of life on Earth. The circulation of heat beneath the crust drives volcanism and plate tectonics. Those same forces recycle minerals, shape continents, regulate atmospheric chemistry over geological timescales, and help sustain conditions where oceans and living systems can persist. The eruption that nearly erased our species was produced by the same restless planet that also nourished the environments our ancestors depended upon. Earth's instability is not separate from evolution. Ice ages alter migration routes. Drought reshapes ecosystems. Volcanoes bury landscapes beneath ash that later becomes fertile soil. Environmental pressure forces, adaptation, experimentation, and change. Species are shaped not in spite of instability, but through it. Humanity emerged from that same difficult conversation between life and a planet that never stops changing. 8 billion people now move across the surface of the Earth. Cities glow against coastlines visible from orbit. Aircraft cross oceans through the night. Languages rise from crowded streets and quiet kitchens. Music drifts from windows. Satellites circle overhead in careful silence. Yet all of this abundance traces backward through time toward an astonishingly narrow point, toward a population so small it could have gathered inside a modern sports stadium with empty seats still remaining. Every inheritance of humanity emerged from that fragile continuity. Every story ever whispered beside a fire, every monument lifted from stone, every poem carried across generations, every scientific discovery, every moment of tenderness between parents and children, all of it depended upon those survivors enduring long enough to see another season. The chain was never broken. It only became thinner, quieter, and more vulnerable than it had ever been before. Science rarely offers revelations that feel both intimate and immense at the same time. This story does. Genetics, archaeology, climatology, and paleoanthropology converge into something larger than data alone. They reveal how contingent our existence truly is. Not impossible, not miraculous in a supernatural sense, but improbably narrow. A coastline remained habitable. Certain food sources endured. Small groups adapted quickly enough to changing conditions. Children survived winters severe enough to erase entire populations elsewhere. The people who carried humanity through that darkness had no knowledge of their future importance. They did not know they stood inside one of the most consequential bottlenecks in the history of life. They were not symbols. They were simply human beings trying to continue. A mother keeping embers alive through cold nights, someone searching tidal pools at low water, someone repairing a fractured tool beneath sheltering stone while ash dimmed the sky beyond the cave entrance. Survival from the inside rarely appears dramatic. It is repetitive, exhausting, uncertain work measured in ordinary actions. Finding water before thirst deepens, preserving warmth until morning, sharing food carefully enough that the group lasts another week. The vast future of humanity rested upon thousands of moments so small they would have seemed forgettable to the people living them. Yet persistence accumulates. One generation survives long enough to raise another. A child inherits knowledge shaped by earlier hardship. A path along the shoreline becomes familiar across decades. Gradually, populations expand again. Migrations begin. Languages diversify. Cultures emerge across continents. The volcanic winter passes into memoryless geological layers while life resumes its slow outward movement. The ash eventually settled back onto the earth. Rain returned to damaged landscapes. Vegetation spread again across valleys that had fallen silent. The descendants of those reduced coastal populations walked outward into a recovering world, carrying within them the compressed inheritance of nearly all surviving humanity. Over thousands of generations, that inheritance multiplied into billions of distinct lives, somewhere inside your own cells, within strands of DNA copied again and again across approximately 3,000 generations, remains molecular evidence of that continuity. The sequences themselves are ordinary chemistry, nucleotides arranged through biological inheritance, yet together they form an unbroken connection, stretching backward to people who endured one of the most difficult passages our species has ever faced. Their survival is not distant from you. It is present in every living human body, quietly continuing